Hello, this is Jim Schaefer. I'm the host for the new academic book program called Rip Rap.
Our second episode today is with Fernando Coronil, who's written a new book called The Magical State. Fernando, how did you come up with the title, The Magical State?
You know, a title kind of summarizes an argument. But of course, in the process of writing the book, then it became evident to me that I was engaged in the process of being like a cultural broker. That is, I was a person who was mediating between Venezuela and the US and had to write a book for two audiences. And so I thought that somehow the title had to represent that kind of situation. And I think there are multiple meanings to the magical state. I think one meaning, of course, of magical, probably when people in the US or even in Latin America think about Latin America, think of the place which has been identified, in fact, by many writers as the place of the magical, marvelous, realismo maravilloso, place identified by people, you know, like Garcia Marquez or Alejo Carpentier, who talked about magical realism. And so I had that kind of denotation in mind, that kind of association. But then I also had more like a technical kind of denotations, like, for instance, when people like Max Weber or talks about, you know, the power, the charisma of the state, of state figures, you know, or when Marx talks about the fetishism of money or of the state. And so that's the second meaning about magical. And then the third meaning had to do with actually a meaning of given to the Venezuelan state by a Venezuelan playwright, José Ignacio Cabrujas, who he was actually a writer of soap operas. And he had his pulse on Venezuelan political culture. And he was actually interviewed to give his opinion about Venezuelan politics. And he, in I think, a very interesting interview, he said what most political scientists had failed to see, which is that the Venezuelan state is like a magnanimous sorcerer who, through its wealth, its petroleum wealth, manages to produce reality out of a hat, like a magician. And so my title, The Magical State, tries to kind of encompass these three meanings. And I guess one of the things I try to do in doing that is avoid, I guess, one problem, which is, on the one hand, when you are in this position that I mentioned before of a cultural broker, one danger, of course, is to, if you think of it from the side of, you know, coming from the US, going back to Venezuela, of given the kind of inequality between our countries, is to appear as if you had, you know, wisdom, knowledge, sophistication, and you're going to instruct people there, and that you bring, you know, the most sophisticated social science theories and stuff like that. I wanted to avoid very much that position. And of course, the other danger is to be represented in the US as a person who has the authentic native voice, you know, as a person who, because I come from Venezuela, then I kind of can represent that with authenticity. And so also the magical state, in my own mind, is a way of countering illusions. The illusion of the authentic voice, the illusion of the person who comes with sophisticated knowledge, because in my narrative in the book I kind of play with those ideas and try to present a much more complex understanding of the kind of relation between center and periphery, which is one of the major arguments of the book.
Well, it centers on Venezuela, but it seems to have, you know, implications far beyond Latin and South America, and, you know, even globally, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the idea. You know, like in the literature, if you look at the literature on Latin America or in the third world, countries like Venezuela that are very wealthy and yet belong to the third world are typically excluded because they don't seem to have had the same kind of problems that afflict most third world nations because they've been wealthy, like Venezuela has been wealthy throughout most of this century. So, you know, they're seen as part of the third world, yet not part of the third world. What I'm trying to argue in this book, actually, is that Venezuela is very much part of the third world, and that many of the problems that characterize Venezuela, including in the times of affluence, when Venezuela, you know, had a period of prosperity and stability during most of the century, even then, many of the structural features of Venezuela were similar to the kind of problems that afflicted other nations. So that maybe what's happening now, the crisis of Venezuela, is no surprise. I mean, many people were surprised by that. But if you look at it from a different perspective, you realize that actually the crisis was something that could be expected. And if you examine Venezuela carefully, which is what I think I've tried to do, and structurally, not just in terms of the appearance of things, you realize that Venezuela become a way of understanding most third world nations that, like Venezuela, also depend on primary export products for their foreign exchange. So you think of the Central American nations, so-called banana republics. If you think of Argentina with wheat and beef, if you think of Peru with guano in the 19th century, if you think of all the oil-producing nations or copper in Chile, most of these countries, in one way or another, because of international division of labor, depend. The foreign exchange depends on a few primary commodities. Venezuela, of course, depends much more so on oil, but and oil, unlike most of those commodities, has produced some kind of constant revenues throughout the century, which has exempted Venezuela in some ways from these other countries, which have had more uneven cycles of boom and bust. But what my book argues is that actually Venezuela can become a mirror through which you can understand many of these societies. And so you're right. I mean, I think the argument is about Venezuela, but has more general implications, and that's one of the things I'm trying to argue in the book.
One of the other things, talking about the role of cultural broker or interpreter, what is maybe this is a difficult question to answer, but the view of those in the United States and highly industrialized countries toward Venezuela, third world countries, and the view of Venezuela and those other countries toward the United States. I mean, there's things that are not being picked up on both sides, even though they're becoming more and more important that they should be.
Right. This is a really good question, a very difficult question to answer. I mean, the view of, it's such a complex question because there are so many subjects who have different kinds of views. If you think of, for instance, writers, in Latin America they have a very particular kind of relationship to the U.S., and the relationship is mediated by the importance of people like Faulkner or Melville, and they admire those writers just like they might admire Joyce or Proust. And for them, the U.S. is like a site of tremendous creativity, Now, if you look at, of course, politicians or businessmen, that's a different story. And then what you have there then is a more kind of typical kind of stereotypes from the perspective of the U.S. You have the sense that, Latin Americans are, it's a place where you have this kind of caudillos, so these kind of military leaders who are just, power hungry, and you have businessmen who are corrupt and just want to get wealthy without developing technologies and without really developing industries, but trying to benefit from kind of political connections. And it's those kind of biases that I think and on the other hand, of course, from the perspective of Latin Americans, you have the view that the U.S. the typical view is that the U.S. is the most developed, nation on earth, with the most advanced capitalists, with the most sophisticated technology, and that's, of course, one group. Of course, on the other side, on the left, you might have the view that the U.S. is a place where you have, very, power-hungry businessmen and politicians who want to abuse Latin America and exploit Latin America. So you have, a set of, you can imagine all the views that you have about in this whole range of possibilities. But I think I think there is some kind of common denominator. I think that there is a generalized perception of that. It's disturbing, but I think it's there that is shared by intellectuals, by leftists, by rightists, conservatives, that some kind of basic cultural difference between the U.S. and economic difference between the U.S. and Latin America, that the U.S. is the most developed, advanced capitalist nation on earth, and I think people kind of share that. And that countries like Latin America, Venezuela, what any other country in Latin America are countries that are trying to get to modernize, and that the process is difficult, and try to do that throughout the century, and that most programs have failed. And of course now the last word now is, of course, the neoliberalism, that if we change our policies, we'll be able to finally become modern. But of course that's
the myth of modernity.
The myth of modernity, that's a big question, of course. That's what is one of the issues that I try to discuss in the book as well.
You talk about different artists in Venezuela, and the cover of your book is painted by a friend of yours.
Yes. Part of the production of the book is also trying to start some kind of dialogue between Latin American and U.S. and European voices. And I tried very hard to, in my book, precisely because of the kind of mediating position that I have, to have Latin American voices represented, informing the book. And I meant that from the cover all the way to the kind of citations, to the kind of theories that inform my narrative, to the perspective that informs my book. And so the cover, I wanted very much to have like a painting or some representation by a Venezuelan person. And what's great about this cover is that this is a cover by Jacobo Borges, who is a Venezuelan painter who actually now is internationally well known. But he's a man who very committed to progressive causes in Venezuela. He's a man from humble social origin, and who for this cover did the same thing actually I did for the book. He did research in the archives and studied photographs of heads of state. And so he came up with his own kind of aesthetic representation, transformation of those pictures. And what the cover represents is some kind of synthesis of the... So I think it's a wonderful painting, which is also very evocative because he has this kind of red circle underneath, which almost works like a Rorschach test. You can project all kinds of things into it.
Is there anything significant with it being a circle or cyclic?
Yeah, the painting is called Meeting the Red Circle or Circle of Lunatics. So almost there's this kind of image of this circle, that could be anything you want, but also it's a circle of lunatics. And also the red, of course, I think brings up all kinds of associations, including associations with violence.
In Venezuela, past the amount of oil that the United States receives from Saudi Arabia, so it would seem that it's going to be placing Venezuela even more in spotlight, but is that something that's going to create additional difficulties for Venezuela?
For the U.S., it's better to have Venezuela as a supplier of oil than the Middle East. Very unstable over there, kind of stable up down here, also for businesses. So the plan is to make Venezuela, to double Venezuelan oil production from 3 million barrels to 6.9 billion barrels a day in a few years. And Venezuela is already producing 18% of U.S. oil, the oil that it imports. And of course, there will be lots of capital in Venezuela going into this production, and some people
They prefer to have just a small number of leaders that they send the money to,
Right.
and they become the practitioners of the magic state.
Right.
And they hold out these little possibilities of a developing industry. You talk about that in your book too, about the attempts to build an auto industry or something like that, and it just doesn't work.
Right. And one of the interesting things about, precisely the magical state is that for a long time it was a magical state because there was the illusion that the state was a site where politicians could actually determine things, even if they couldn't do much, but at least for a long time in this century, the state indeed was the site where, the place where politicians, established developmental programs, which were then only partially fulfilled, but still there was quite a bit of power, and they had the capacity to, particularly in Venezuela, to do things, But now, with this business of globalization, you see that all these politicians, from Caldera, who Clinton visited just this week, and Cardoso and Menem in Argentina, states are formally sovereign in the context in which they are increasingly less autonomous and less powerful because the context in which they work is increasingly global. And they have less and less power to determine the conditions under which the countries function. So this kind of paradox that you have nations that are increasingly democratic, because that has happened in Latin America, most dictatorships have been surpassed by now by democratic regimes, and you have formally democratic states, people like Caldera in Venezuela, Cardoso, Menem in Argentina. And yet, when it comes down to the process of dictating policies, they cannot really implement policy. So even the state itself has a place of maybe potential magic in which people could invest in them the illusion that they are going to solve problems. I think that itself is changing. And the market is being celebrated as the supreme magician. Now, I think there's a shift now from the state as a site of a place where people put their hopes to the market. But the market, as you know, it's a kind of it's a magician that works for some people but not for others. And I think people are beginning to realize that it represents a shift from kind of collective efforts of success or accomplishment or development to a situation which what the market is really promoting is individual achievement. And certainly some people will be successful and they will do very well, but I think most people won't do so well, not because of any fault of their own, but because of structural conditions. In this kind of context, it's just structurally impossible for everyone to do well. So there will be winners and there will be losers. And of course there will be fewer winners than losers. And I think that situation is a very dangerous situation. It's not the kind of situation one I mean, as a policymaker, that's not the kind of situation that you want to promote.
Makes things more volatile. There's also this concept that Clinton's been pushing, trade reform
Right.
and NAFTA,
Right.
Extended to Latin America.
Right, that's to create an open market. That would be wonderful. It could be all human beings on Earth with some kind of equal footing. But the kind of unification that free market promotes is one which is highly polarizing and destructive of local traditions, and so it's very problematical. I think it has to be rethought.
You had mentioned violence before, and certainly there's some awareness of that, but what are some of the specific ways that violence comes out in Venezuela and Latin America?
Well, one specific form of violence is just the violence of everyday limitations and deprivations, which is the most, and it's not just in Latin America. And what's interesting is what happened in Latin America is happening everywhere, in Asia, Africa, and also in Europe and in the US. And if you look at the percentages of poor people in the world, it's growing, even in the US. If you look at patterns of concentration of income, it's growing in the US, not only in Latin America. It grows faster there, but it's also growing in the US tremendously. Poor people are also increasing in Europe, in England, in France, in Spain, in the US, the proportion. So in Latin America, it's even worse. I think, for instance, out of a population of 500 million people in Latin America, more or less, I think that 200 million people are poor now, and the proportion is growing. Critical poverty in Venezuela, for instance, now is 70%. In places like some of the West Indies, it's like 90%, and the proportion is growing in time. Income distribution is getting more concentrated everywhere, including the U.S. I think from 1980, let's say, to 1996 in the U.S., 1980 to 1996, 5% of the population, the top 5% in the U.S., moved from 15% to 20% of the income, of the national income, and the lowest 60% from 35% to 30%. So there is a division, and that is worse in Latin America. So if you want to think about structural violence, for instance, then you have to think that poverty is the most clear manifestation of the violence of these kind of policies, because it subjects people to miserable conditions, conditions in which even the joys of life, having some kind of life in which you can have families and have kids and feel that you can have a future for them, it's really difficult in most places in Latin America. So people have to struggle just to survive, and that creates all kinds of domestic violence, all kinds of other forms of hidden violence, which are terrifying. But in addition to a kind of more silent structural violence that many liberation theologians write about and talk about in Latin America, there is also the kind of violence that is more familiar to U.S. audiences, when people actually say no and then rebel and protest and complain about the conditions, and there has been some kind of, I think, growth of that kind of rioting, violent protests in Latin America throughout the last 20 years, and Venezuela is a case in point in which, as soon as these IMF measures were established in 1989, there were riots.
Before, some of these countries could have existed in more remoteness, in the sense of being perceived by other countries, but now it's right there on your television.
Right. It's funny too, because at the same time there is more centralization and concentration of media. I mean, like there's as you know, it's a consolidation of power, so that there is more information, but fewer people control the information. But on the other hand, there are all kinds of information that circulates in all kinds of ways, a minimum sense of rationality and understanding that we have to care about our future. As our collective future means that we have to be more aware of the limitations of policies which end up privileging the few to the detriment of the majorities. And I think that maybe there is hope in this collective realization that things going to continue the way they have been going at this point.
Making a movie out of this book.
Ago, when I wrote a chapter on a murder that took place in Venezuela, I showed this chapter to a professor of mine at the University of Chicago, Paul Friedrich, when he read that chapter, he said, "Fernando, this is a movie. You have to get a movie out of this, because this is a chapter which, analyzes, transformations that are taking place in Venezuela, which of course deal with the state and key events, which are kind of very dramatic and very mysterious. But so if there is someone interested in agents, there's some place who wants to."
Oh, when I read it, Right away, I thought of the people who produced Dead Man Walking, Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins, somebody like that that had the imagination to take on a project like that. But it brings back memories of that movie Z, you know, when there's kind of a conspiracy or a real tension between the government and certain figures and the willingness to do whatever it takes in order to control what's going to happen. So
well, it would be wonderful, and also it would be very contemporary. It would be precisely about the kinds of things that are happening now in the world. So,
and it's an issue that's because of globalization becoming much more important, and the oil issue too, which I think people are going to realize as this starts unfolding just how dramatic that agreement was that Clinton came to Venezuela to sign. That when you're talking about doubling the production in Venezuela and trying to get off the dependence of Saudi Arabia, which ultimately could change the nature of the balance of power in the Middle East.
That's
It's
right.
going to be quite a moment for Venezuela in the global spotlight.
That's a good way of putting it. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So how does it feel now that you've written this fantastic book and getting all this acclaim and all that stuff?
Well, well, I have a bunch of projects actually. It's hard to I have very many projects, and one that I'm thinking about, and it's appealing to me a lot, is a comparative study between Cuba and Venezuela, and trying to understand what's happening to Cuban society as it opens up to the market, and also what's happening to Venezuela as it also continues to open up to the market, and try to do some kind of comparison, and focusing on the role of money actually in both places, because all kinds of interesting things are happening in Cuba in the connection between money and power, you know, like opening up the economy and opening up the political system.
It's really coming in a position of, I don't know, it's a real importance.
No, I think precisely moments like this when somehow everyone thinks, or many people think, that this is the end of history, that all the problems have been solved, that the market is going to solve all the problems, that neoliberalism is the solution, are the times in which open up possibilities for the unexpected. And I think that we'll soon realize that what we believe now to be true, I mean, the powers that are, the people who determine policies and who are convinced that certain things have to happen because that's the best way to organize society, will soon realize that maybe that's not the case. And there will be, I think, hopefully, a time for rethinking things and to ask more fundamental questions and to imagine alternative ways of organizing society. So I think that's you know, going to happen in the next few years. I think this is an interesting moment, and we're going through kind of a dark moment of seductive kind of sense of progress and clarity. But I think problems will begin to hit us in the face, and then we'll have to rethink our assumptions and the premises that organize our thinking at this moment. So we better be prepared for that, I think. We should start thinking already about the future.